I appreciate you all being so faithful to these parables. We have 12 weeks and we're now at the third week. So the good news is we will be finished in time for the holidays, not for Halloween, but for Thanksgiving and Christmas. Um, Today, I want to go back and look at a little bit of what we've done just to set the particular parable for today in position so that we understand what Jesus is doing in parables. Parables are stories, but they are more than that in the way that Jesus uses them. Jesus takes something that is commonplace, that is ordinary, and he puts that down on one side. And then next to it, he puts the spiritual or deeper message for our lives. So what you and I are trying to do is we're trying to bring together what Jesus said in the parable and bring it into our own lives, into the lives that we live, and ask ourselves the question, what does this have to say to me and to my life? The parable today is really a part of a larger segment of Scripture. It begins with Jesus is at prayer. Now, you don't read this in the parable, but this is right before the parable. Jesus is at prayer. His disciples come to him and they ask him a very interesting question. They said, will you teach us to pray as John taught his disciples to pray? Now, John is not mentioned in the Lord's Prayer in Matthew, but we know from Luke that what happens, you remember John the Baptist was a very powerful preacher and attracted disciples. And many of these people became John's disciples. It was very difficult to move them over to become the disciples of Jesus. Jesus, will you teach us to pray as John has taught his disciples to pray? Now, what Jesus does in Luke's gospel is give a very short version of what we find in the 6th chapter of Matthew, the Lord's Prayer that we usually recite. The Lord's Prayer that is used in the liturgy or the worship of the church is in Matthew's gospel. In Luke's gospel, we have this shortened, and we ordinarily don't use this in our communal worship. But one of the things I think we need to keep in mind is that the Lord's Prayer is a communal prayer. There is a difference between communal prayer and private or personal prayer. When I pray on behalf of the community, it is a we prayer. In other words, God, you are speaking to all of us. God, we all come together to pray for your kingdom to come and for your will to be done. When I have a private prayer, it is an I prayer. I'm not going to try to remember the exact words of the Lord's Prayer to pray when I pray in private. But this is a prayer that the church used, particularly in Matthew's version. Now, some of you may look at this prayer and say to yourself, it's missing something. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Again, you can squeeze the 6th chapter of Matthew, you can squeeze this chapter in Luke, and you will not find, for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Those words came in about 100, and we could use AD, or we can use what is often used these days, CE, to refer to the Common Era. It came in a writing called the Didache, which was a teaching of the church, written around 100 AD or 100 CE. And in the Didache, when they had the Lord's Prayer, they added, for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. But you and I are not going to find those words in either Matthew's version or in Luke's version. What the church did later on, as it used it in worship, was it realized that something needed to be added to that. And so the church added the phrase that we often, or that we always end in the Lord's Prayer. This is an unusual parable. After Jesus' disciples say, will you teach us to pray? Then Jesus says, I want to tell you a parable. He begins the parable with the word suppose. Now that's a giveaway that this is a make-up story. Somebody has said it probably would have been better if Jesus had begun this parable by saying, you are not going to believe what I'm about to say. First of all, there is a friend who goes to his friend's house at midnight, maybe not the most opportune time for you and me to have a friend come by to ask something of us. But in Jewish life, hospitality was a very important thing. The Jews were well known for their hospitality, not only to other Jews, but also to other people. So immediately we hit kind of a bump in the road when all of a sudden this friend, who was in his house, the other friend comes to the door. A friend has come to visit me. Will you lend me 3 loaves of bread? And the friend on the inside, instead of doing what we would expect, getting up from his bed, going to the door and saying, here are 3 loaves of fish, what he does is he says, my children and I are already in bed. Now that little slice lets you and me know that this was a Jewish peasant's house. In a Jewish peasant's house, the people usually slept on the floor, and they all slept together. I've already tucked my children in where I'm sleeping. He didn't mention his spouse. I suppose he could have said, my wife is also tucked in, the door's locked, don't bother me, go away. But the man was persistent. The friend was persistent in what he wanted to get. And so finally, the friend inside said, it's not so much because you're my friend, it's because of your persistence in asking. He went to the door and gave to his friend who was asking 3 loaves of bread. Now, let me say a word before we go any further into the story. This is a powerful example of how a story should be told and can be told by those of us who are ministers. Many of us who are ministers, when we tell a story, we operate as if we are the reporter who is standing there with a microphone commenting on something that is going on behind us. A better way to tell a story, and the way that Jesus did, was by entering the story and becoming the characters and speaking in first person. A friend of mine has come and I don't have anything to give him to eat. Will you lend me 3 loaves of bread? Don't you understand? My family is already tucked in on the floor. And you're asking me to get up from my sleep and come? It's not just because you're a friend, it's because you're persistent that I'm going to give you the bread. Good storytellers are people who are able to enter the story and tell it from what I call the inside out. Not just reporting. There was a man who wanted 3 loaves of bread. There was a man who was asleep with his family. There was a man who didn't want to get up from his bed. All of that is like reporting the story. Why not enter the story and tell it as if you and I are part of the story, which Jesus does in this parable? Now we're going to see in this parable kind of a mixture of the first 2 parables that we've looked at. The first parable, you remember, had no characters in it. Jesus was beginning his ministry. He said, I want to compare what is happening to somebody who puts a new patch on an old cloth. It tears. I want to compare what is going on now to somebody who puts new wine in old wineskins. In other words, Jesus was saying something radically new is happening. And it's not that I'm going to stop being a Jew, but I'm going to let you know that some of the things that you've used as your containers, some of the laws that you've used, some of the things that you've thought of as being so sacred to you, some of those things are going to break away. The second parable that we looked at was the Good Samaritan, filled with characters. And we went around and said, which of the characters would you be? And I told you that when I taught preaching and I would ask the students, who are you in this story? 9 out of 10 of them would be Jesus or God, or in this case, the Good Samaritan. Why not be the priest? Why not understand that the priest is not passing by on the other side because he doesn't care about this person, but the priest has something that is uppermost in his mind, and that is the Levitical law of purity. See, that's the kind of thing that Jesus is going to have to break through. There's a man who is hurt by the side of the road. And what the priest and the Levite are doing is the purity laws that we have say that we're not to touch somebody who may be dead. Otherwise, we have to go and we have to become pure again, which was not an easy task. We go into this parable and we encounter bread. Do you know, anytime you and I see bread in the New Testament, we're going to think about some things. Primarily, we're going to think about when Jesus had the final Passover meal with his disciples. What did he do? He broke the bread. When I was growing up in church, we had the communion table in the front. Do this in remembrance of me. You know what I thought as a 12-year-old and looking at that? I thought that I was supposed to remember something about Jesus that Jesus had done. What I didn't understand is that when you and I remember something, we not only remember it in the past, but it yanks us into the future and gives us strength and hope for the days, for the living of the days and the nights that we have out ahead of us. In other words, Jesus was saying, I want you to take this bread, and every time you break the bread, you do it in remembrance of me. And what I think about is, I think about not only what Jesus did in his life, in his earthly life, but I'm thinking about what Jesus is doing in the future, in the present and the future of my life. So bread has that kind of feel to it. It makes you and me remember. Remember the first time that you sang Amazing Grace? I was listening to a worship service not long ago, not ours. The minister of music said, we're going to sing this first and fourth stanzas of Amazing Grace. I wanted to come out of the seat, it was virtual, and say, what about the third verse? As I've told some of you in sermons, when our son David was diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor, he was 10 years old. I had a pastor knock on my door. I'd only been in Augusta 2.5 months. My name is Tracy Chuning. I'm the longtime pastor of a small Baptist church here in Augusta. Chuck, I heard what happened to your family. I've just come by to hold your hand. He prayed for me. He walked to the door. He turned around. Chuck, don't ever forget the words of the hymn. Through many dangers, toils and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. I remember many times when I have sung the third stanza of Amazing Grace. But at that moment, it was like being pulled into the present and into the future. Here are the words I want to share with you, Chuck, words that can nurture you in the living of your days and your nights. The bread is given, and then we make kind of a turn again toward prayer. That's where we started. We started with Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer. Ask, and it shall be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be open to you. It is a word about the persistence of prayer. Then Jesus changes the analogy to that of a parent and a child. If a child came and asked his parent, would that parent give that child a snake or a scorpion? Or would that parent give that child a good gift? Now, here's where I want you to respond, because I think, I not only think, I believe that we have a problem. What if I stand to preach and I say to the congregation, ask and it will be given you, seek and you will find, knock and it will be open unto you? What does that sound like in terms of the promise of a prayer? Would you think if I did those things that my prayer should be answered? If I persisted in asking God those things, that my prayer should be answered? I don't think so, because we've got to take a couple of things into consideration. One is Jesus begins the Lord's Prayer not with you and me, not with you and my asking a petition of God, but it is recognizing who God is. Father, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. So what I'm saying at the very beginning of prayer, of any kind of prayer, is this is not a prayer about just doing something for me and what I want. Rather, it is a prayer recognizing that life is in God's hands. A young husband and wife came into my office and they said, our child is stillborn. We're not members of your church, but we've been coming. Would you have a prayer for our child? Small casket, went to the funeral home. Could I have said to this mother and dad, why, if you had just come to me sooner, we wouldn't have had a child that died, because we would have persisted in asking and seeking and knocking. Would I have said that? The answer is no, because that's not how prayer is. How many times have we prayed for something to be the way that we want it to be? And we've had to learn that what prayer fundamentally is recognizing who God is and turning life over to God, so that whether the prayer is answered in the way that we want, God is still God. Also, something else that doesn't carry that message in the parable. The friend is reluctant to answer the need of his friend who wants bread. Can you imagine God's ever saying to you and me, maybe the prayer won't be answered in the way that you have prayed, but I'm a God who has locked the doors and I'm already comfortable and I really rather not come out to see you. That is not the analogy of the God in which I believe. In 1981, a Jewish rabbi by the name of Harold Kushner wrote a book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Somebody said, Rabbi Kushner, why don't you entitle it Why Bad Things Happen to Good People? Kushner said, if I'd given it that title, I could have written the book in 3 words, I don't know. When bad things happen to good people. Do you know that was one of the very few religious books that ever made it to the top of the New York Times bestseller list? Why? Because Kushner said in the beginning of his book, this is not an abstract book about suffering. This is a book about my son, Aaron. Aaron had the disease where somebody ages very quickly, and Aaron passed away at the age of 14. Kushner said in the introduction of his book, I never thought that anything like this would happen to me. I know that I'm not the best person in the world, but compared to most people, I've really tried to live my life for God. I know that we may not be the best family in the world, but compared to most families, our family has tried to uplift God in our lives. I'm not writing this as an abstract book on suffering. I'm writing it as somebody whose child died at age 14. We could go around the room if we were meeting in person in the church, and if we had time. What has happened to you that was not the way you prayed? Some of you know Frederick Buechner, the wonderful Presbyterian minister and writer. Buechner says, God speaks through what happens to us. Not God speaks through what we would like to have happen to us, but God can speak through what happens to us in our lives. I have met people who have walked through the valley of the shadow of death and have emerged as the most empathetic, caring, loving, understanding, warm people that I know. I have met people who haven't been within 40 miles of any kind of profound suffering in their lives. And they don't have time, and they don't understand. I was a young minister and did a very foolish thing. And the woman called me on it. Standing in line, people coming by. You know what I did? She was there speaking to me, and I was looking over her shoulder at the next person in line. She said, Pastor, you're not listening to me. And she walked on. I will do the same thing. If I'm trying to share my heart with somebody and that person is looking over her shoulder or looking around to see who is in the group and who's next, I'm going to shut it down. I mentioned to you a few years ago, well, 5 years ago now, at Stetson, which I know is not Georgetown. And unfortunately, Stetson has gone the way of all flesh, I hate to say. When I was there, it was a Baptist school, it was a Christian school, no longer Christian, no longer Baptist. But when I went to homecoming, the chaplain was a friend of mine. He called himself a Buddhist Baptist. I said, Mike, what in the world is a Buddhist Baptist? He said, well, you know, Chuck, I grew up as a Baptist and I've always been a Baptist, but there is this Buddhist priest who has really ministered to me. He had some illness, and this Buddhist priest has really ministered to me. And so I call myself a Buddhist Baptist. Well, in talking with him several weeks before, what do you want me to do in chapel? Is this the kind of chapel where I talk in glaring generalities about perhaps somewhere, someplace, there may be a God? I know many of you don't believe in God, but let's all be nice to each other. Let's all be kind to each other. Let's all be caring to each other. I said to Mike, I'm a Christian minister. I can't preach and deny my identity. And so I spoke as a Christian minister. I told David's story. And a very attractive, I think I mentioned this to you, a very attractive young couple coming out the door. I had said we took David to the edge of the cliff. We felt the mist of death in our face, but we were able to bring him back. The woman looked at me and she said, we went to the edge of the cliff. We felt the mist in our face. We didn't bring our daughter back. I was almost ready to fall all over myself to apologize. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that my story ended with my bringing my son back. And I'm sorry that you didn't bring your daughter back. But you know what she did? She hugged me. I mean, I was going to fall all over myself verbally, apologizing for what I saw as a big mistake in what I had done. She hugged me and she said, we didn't bring our child back, but we know what you've gone through. And I want to tell you, sometimes you open the treasure chest and a hug is worth more than all the money in that chest. I cannot believe that if I am simply persistent with God, that God is going to do it my way all of the time. What I believe is that God calls me to petition God in prayer. Petition is a part of prayer. But God fundamentally calls me to acknowledge God as the hallowed one, as the holy one, as the one who has life in God's hands. And what I'm not going to do or try not to do in prayer is to reverse things where suddenly I am God telling this so-called God what God must do. Sometimes, as Buechner says, God speaks through what happens to us, not just through what we wanted to happen to us. And sometimes God dips deeply into our lives. And suddenly we know, if we ever had any illusion that we were sufficient for life by ourselves, we know that God has dipped deeply into the innermost parts of our lives and made us realize it is God. I was preaching a revival at the First Baptist Church in Macon, Georgia. It's been a number of years ago. The minister of music said to me after the Sunday night service, we started on Sunday night, I want you to come down to the nursery to see my baby. The minister of music's name was Ben Taylor. Now, don't tell anybody this because I don't want this to get around. But do you know what I thought? I thought, Ben, I have seen a lot of babies as a minister in my life, and you're wanting me to walk down the stairs. I've got people to see. So I said, Ben, how about tomorrow night we go down to see your daughter? Do you know who was right there on my side on Monday night? Ben Taylor. Okay, Ben, let's go see your daughter. We started down the steep stairs. Ben said, turned around to me after about 2 steps, she's named after me, Mary Ben Taylor. A few more steps, turned around. Do you know what? She's named after me, Mary Ben Taylor. A few more steps, and I said, I know. She's named after you, Mary Ben Taylor. He walked into the nursery, picked up, she's named after me. Did I tell you that? Ben said. Picked up Mary Ben Taylor and put her in my arms. And when I looked at her eyes, I knew immediately Mary Ben Taylor had Down syndrome. I want you to see my baby. I went back to the motel that night and I just sat in the chair thinking to myself, what have I witnessed? I don't believe Ben and his wife prayed for this to happen, but I know what Ben has done with it and what his wife has done with it. They have taken something that happened to them in their lives and they have turned it into ethics. They have started a whole movement of people, of children who have Down syndrome, ministering to each other. They took something bent and broken. They turned it into ethics. She's named after me. And when I sat there in the chair, all I could think about was a father who loved his daughter so much, regardless of the circumstances. So what Jesus is saying, I want you to pray. I want you to be persistent. I want you to bring your petitions to God. But I want you to understand who this God is. God is not somebody to whom we pray as if we're moving somebody around on the chessboard of our desires. This is God. Hallowed or holy is the name of God. Holy is God. And so, if God is holy, and I'm going to believe deeply in my life that that is true, and I have given most of my life to being a minister, to preach that kind of word to families where a couple in the back, I knew they were getting a divorce, and I knew the pain they were feeling. A woman on the third row of the church, she had been to the doctor that week, called me, the diagnosis is not good, looking at me saying, can you tell me about a God? And in the balcony, a beautiful 15-year-old girl, for a while drugged, something she did, playing with at the edges of her life. But now they had captured the very center of who she was. I wasn't looking at people on any given Sunday for whom life was like the story that we all grew up with, and they went off and they lived happily ever after. I mean, Diana's probably listening, but I do have to tell you this. I thought our marriage had ended the first week we were married. Because what I didn't factor in the marriage was that you had disagreements. Now, I use the word disagreement because as a minister, argument sounds pretty rough, but we were in a small seminary apartment. We'd been out to buy curtains for the apartment. We got back. The curtains didn't fit. They weren't the right curtains. I said, Diane, why did you get these curtains? I didn't know they weren't going to fit. It was a Saturday afternoon. I was really upset. When you go buy curtains, you want them to fit and match. Well, we made it through the first week, and this December we're coming up on 53 years. So I guess if you can make it through the first week, you could probably make it for a few more weeks and months and years. But that's not the way I envision marriage. And it caught me off guard because I thought we go off and we live happily ever after. When I was a minister, I wanted the people in the church to pray. But I was not going to get up and say, this person has been healed and it's a miracle. And your wife has died. What do we call that? We may call it a miracle. Because who knows when something happens to us, the holiness and the grace and the sufficiency of God may speak to us in ways that we never imagined.